For several hours, the world believed it was looking at a dead actor behind glass. Not in a hospital room, not in a funeral hall, but inside an art museum. The image appeared quietly at first. A blurred photograph taken inside Beijing's 798 art zone, posted without context, without confirmation, without explanation. Inside a transparent glass case lay a motionless human figure, pale under dim lighting, arranged with unsettling precision. The body was still. Too still. Too real to be easily dismissed as sculpture. Within minutes, a single question began spreading across screens in different languages and time zones. Was that Yu Menglong? What followed was not immediate outrage, but something more fragile and dangerous, disbelief mixed with hope. Fans leaned closer to their screens, enlarging the image pixel by pixel. They examined the jawline, the posture, the hairline, the familiar gentleness frozen in the face. Some denied it outright. Others went silent. A few began to cry before they fully understood why. As the image spread, the silence around it grew heavier. There was no official announcement, no confirmation, no denial. Only whispers moving faster than facts, carried by algorithms designed to reward emotional urgency. Hashtags emerged almost simultaneously, pulling strangers into a shared moment of confusion and dread. What began as a rumor quickly transformed into a collective vigil. Yu Menglong had never been a figure associated with noise or provocation. His public image was built on restraint, softness, and a quiet sincerity that made audiences feel safe rather than impressed. He was not known for scandals, nor for dramatic gestures. His presence felt gentle, almost protective, as if his silence itself was a form of care. That was precisely why the image unsettled people so deeply. It violated an unspoken contract between artist and audience, one built on trust and emotional safety. Visitors who went to the museum described the space in hushed terms. The air felt thick, sacred, uncomfortably intimate. Some compared it to walking into a funeral disguised as an exhibition. Inside the glass case, white lilies surrounded the figure. A small plaque rested nearby, carrying a single sentence that would soon echo across the internet. The price of being seen. No name appeared beneath it. No explanation followed. Yet the resemblance was undeniable enough to wound. The uncertainty itself became a blade, cutting deeper than confirmation ever could. Fans were forced to confront a haunting possibility that even in stillness, even in silence, a beloved figure could be transformed into something to be observed, interpreted, and consumed. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial mistakes to the irreversible damage, to see how the entertainment world works and how an icon is redefined. Because this story was never only about whether the body was real, it was about what it meant to believe it was. And once that belief took hold, nothing would ever feel untouched again. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel so that our future investigations can continue to illuminate the truths that often remain hidden behind the entertainment industry's brightest lights. Share this video across every platform where voices gather, because collective awareness is the only force capable of demanding accountability. Let us stand together, not in anger, but in clarity and compassion, to ensure that what happened to Yu Menglong is never repeated. Let us raise our voices so that silence can no longer swallow the struggles of those who give so much of themselves to the world. The shock did not begin with confirmation. It began with resemblance. In the digital age, resemblance alone is often enough to ignite belief. When the image from the 798 art zone surfaced, it arrived without credentials, without institutional authority, and without narrative framing. Yet it spread faster than verified news ever could. This speed was not accidental. It was the result of a cultural environment where emotional recognition frequently outweighs factual certainty. The human figure behind the glass did not need to be identified by name. It needed only to feel familiar. The shape of the face, the posture of stillness, the softness that viewers associated with Yu Menglong were enough to trigger an emotional reflex. Fans were not responding to evidence. They were responding to memory. This is where the root of the crisis truly lies. Yu Menglong's public image had been constructed carefully over time, not through spectacle, but through absence of excess. He was known for restraint, for gentleness, for a kind of emotional minimalism that invited projection. He did not dominate conversations. He did not aggressively define himself. As a result, audiences filled the silence for him. They attached their own interpretations, hopes, and emotional needs to his presence. In media psychology, this dynamic creates a powerful parasocial bond. The audience feels intimacy without reciprocity, connection without contact. Over time, the figure on screen becomes less a performer and more psychological anchor. This bond does not dissolve when the screen goes dark. It intensifies. The exhibit exploited this mechanism, whether intentionally or not. The installation did not present itself as provocation through shock alone. It used stillness, quiet, ambiguity. The glass case resembled preservation, not display. The white lilies invoked mourning. The plaque did not explain, but instead suggested meaning with a single sentence: the price of being seen. And in doing so, the exhibit invited viewers to participate emotionally rather than intellectually. This design choice is critical. It shifted responsibility from the artist to the audience. If viewers felt pain, it was because they recognized something. If they felt grief, it was because they believed. The artwork functioned less as a statement and more as a mirror, reflecting back the emotional investments people had already made. The absence of immediate clarification intensified this effect. Silence from the institution did not neutralize speculation, it amplified it. In the entertainment ecosystem, silence is rarely interpreted as neutrality. It is perceived as concealment, indifference, or strategic distance. Each interpretation deepened mistrust. At the same time, the broader cultural context must be acknowledged. The modern entertainment industry has long been accused of consuming its figures beyond their limits. Burnout, erasure, and emotional commodification are recurring narratives. Within that context, the idea that a performer could be reduced to a symbol even in stillness felt plausible to many. The exhibit did not need to invent cruelty. It merely echoed an existing fear. This is why the reaction felt disproportionate to the available facts. Fans were not only responding to the image, they were responding to years of accumulated anxiety about how the industry treats vulnerability. The glass case became a metaphor for exposure without consent. The still body became a symbol of what happens when a person can no longer control how they are seen. Importantly, this reaction was not limited to devotion. It extended to protection. Many fans expressed outrage not because they believed the body was real, but because the possibility alone felt like a violation. The emotional response preceded verification. In that sense, the crisis was already complete before the truth mattered. This raises a difficult question. At what point does artistic exploration become emotional extraction? When art uses familiarity as its raw material, does it inherit responsibility for the wounds it opens? These questions do not have simple answers, but they define the fault line exposed by this incident. The core argument emerges clearly. This was not a failure of communication alone. It was the collision of parasocial attachment, institutional silence, and an artistic framework designed to provoke feeling without guidance. The result was not reflection, but rupture. And once that rupture occurred, the story could no longer be controlled. What do you think about this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. Once disbelief hardened into attention, the story escaped the boundaries of a single image and entered the machinery of global media. The transition was swift and unforgiving. What had been a quiet moment of confusion became a continuous stream of reactions, interpretations, and emotional broadcasts, each amplifying the last. Social platforms did not ask whether the story was true. They asked whether it was engaging. Clips, screenshots, and reaction videos began circulating within hours. Faces appeared on split screens, eyes widened, voices lowered. Some whispered as if speaking in a sacred space. Others spoke with urgency, warning viewers that something was deeply wrong. Algorithms rewarded intensity, not accuracy. Each emotional response became fuel for the next, creating a feedback loop where grief itself turned into content. Within this avalanche, two dominant currents emerged. The first was outrage grounded in protection. Fans framed the image as a violation, regardless of its authenticity. The argument was simple and emotionally absolute. Even the suggestion that a beloved figure could be displayed without consent was unacceptable. Comments repeated the same phrases across languages and platforms. Art should not hurt the living. Art should not desecrate the dead. The repetition itself became a form of collective mourning, a digital chant intended to reclaim dignity. The second current was quieter but persistent. Art critics and cultural commentators stepped forward to contextualize the exhibit as conceptual provocation. They described it as a confrontation with mortality, a critique of idol worship, a mirror held up to society's obsession with beauty and permanence. In their framing, discomfort was not a flaw, but a necessary outcome. The exhibit, they argued, forced viewers to confront their own complicity in turning people into symbols. This division did not create dialogue. It created distance. For fans, the language of critique felt cold and abstract. For critics, the language of grief felt resistant to interpretation. Both sides spoke past one another, reinforcing their own moral frameworks. The media, sensing friction, leaned into the contrast. Headlines juxtaposed tears against theory, heartbreak against philosophy. The story became less about the exhibit and more about the conflict surrounding it. At the center of this storm stood absence. There was no clear statement naming the figure. No direct response from management. No immediate clarification that could slow the emotional velocity. In crisis communication, silence can be strategic. In this context, it became incendiary. Viewers interpreted the lack of response as avoidance, as calculation, or as indifference. Each interpretation intensified mistrust. Journalists attempted to move the narrative toward verification. Questions surfaced repeatedly. Who authorized the exhibit? Who approved the likeness? What rights were involved? Yet each inquiry ended the same way, with ambiguity and closed doors. Without answers, speculation flourished. Anonymous posts appeared claiming insider knowledge. Screenshots circulated without source or confirmation. Rumor filled the vacuum left by authority. As the avalanche grew, grief evolved into performance. Fans reposted old interviews, fan meeting clips, and gentle moments captured on camera. These montages followed a familiar pattern: soft music, smiling expressions, words associated with warmth and humility. They ended not with resolution, but with accusation. Why did the world return him with coldness? The repetition transformed memory into ritual. Each post functioned as a digital offering, both honoring the past and protesting the present. Psychologists began to comment publicly, introducing the concept of parasocial grief. They described a form of mourning rooted not in personal loss, but in emotional identification. People were grieving not a confirmed death, but the perceived violation of a bond. The commentary reframed the response as understandable, even inevitable, within a culture where connection is mediated through screens. Still, the avalanche did not slow. What was once admiration had turned into collective vulnerability, displayed and consumed in real time. Every tear, every argument, every defense became part of the spectacle. The very dynamic the exhibit appeared to critique was now unfolding beyond the museum walls, multiplied by millions of screens. In this sense, the media response completed the artwork's transformation. The glass case no longer contained the story. The audience did. And by the time the installation quietly closed its doors, the emotional damage had already spread too far to retract. The moment of collapse did not arrive with noise. It arrived with disappearance. Without warning, the installation at the 798 Art Zone closed. No press conference followed. No apology was issued. There was no explanatory statement that acknowledged the emotional storm left behind. The glass case was simply gone, leaving an absence that felt heavier than the image itself. For many, this sudden retreat confirmed what silence had already suggested. The damage had exceeded expectation. But the story did not end with closure. It sharpened. Days later, fragments of information began circulating from unofficial channels. An anonymous post appeared on a hidden forum frequented by art professionals. The author claimed to be a young curator involved indirectly with the project. According to the post, the exhibit had been commissioned months earlier by a private foundation linked to entertainment investors. Its intent, the curator wrote, was not to replicate a specific death, but to construct a symbol. A fallen idol who could never escape public gaze. The figure inside the glass was not a body. It was a replica. Hyper-realistic. Precisely engineered. Created using publicly available footage, three-dimensional scans, and visual data gathered over years of media exposure. Every detail was designed to feel authentic. Not to deceive legally, but to disturb emotionally. The goal, according to the post, was immersion. To make viewers confront how easily familiarity can be mistaken for ownership. When this explanation reached the public, it did not bring relief. In many ways, it made the wound deeper. Because the pain had never depended on physical truth. The grief was already real. Fans had not mourned a body. They had mourned the idea that a person they felt connected to could be reduced to an object without consent. Learning that the figure was artificial did not undo that realization. It reinforced it. Outside the museum, people began to gather quietly. There were no chants. No protests. Only flowers placed on the ground, handwritten letters, photographs printed from old interviews. The tone had shifted from outrage to farewell. Not a goodbye to a life, but to an illusion. The illusion that affection alone could protect someone from becoming a spectacle. In these moments, the figure at the center of the storm transformed again. Yu Menglong was no longer discussed as an individual whose likeness had been used. He became a symbol of something broader and more unsettling, a reminder of how thoroughly the machinery of fame absorbs human presence. Even absence becomes material. Even silence becomes content. Media coverage adjusted accordingly. Psychologists were invited to explain the phenomenon now unfolding in real time. They described parasocial grief not as irrational attachment, but as a predictable response within modern celebrity culture. When audiences invest emotionally without boundaries, the loss they feel is not imaginary. It is internal, private, and deeply personal, even if the relationship itself was one-sided. This reframing marked the turning point. The narrative shifted away from the museum and toward the audience. Questions emerged that could not be directed at curators or institutions alone. Why did so many people feel entitled to certainty? Why did resemblance feel like truth? At what point does admiration cross into possession? The exhibit had vanished, but its effect lingered precisely because it had exposed a shared vulnerability. The realization that millions could experience genuine pain over a symbolic event forced a collective reckoning. Not about art. not about legality, but about responsibility. Responsibility does not belong to one party here. It exists in layers. Institutions that experiment with shock must acknowledge the emotional consequences of ambiguity. Media platforms that reward intensity must confront their role in accelerating distress. Audiences must examine the expectations they place on figures they do not know, yet feel deeply connected to. This was the breakthrough the story demanded, though it arrived without resolution. The glass case no longer existed. The replica had been dismantled, but the questions remained, suspended in public consciousness. The installation had intended to critique the cost of being seen. Instead, it revealed the cost of seeing without limits. And once that realization took hold, it became impossible to return to innocence. When the installation disappeared, the silence it left behind did not feel empty. It felt instructive. No official apology followed. No institutional reflection was publicly offered. The glass case was removed, the lights turned off, and the space returned to neutrality. Yet the emotional imprint remained, lingering far beyond the walls of the museum. For many, the absence itself became the final statement. It confirmed that the story had reached a point where it could no longer be controlled, only abandoned. In the weeks that followed, the conversation evolved. It slowed. It deepened. The initial shock gave way to something more uncomfortable: introspection. People began to ask not what had happened, but why it had hurt so deeply. The focus shifted from the exhibit to the ecosystem that allowed it to resonate so powerfully. At the center of that reckoning stood Yu Menglong, not as a subject of controversy, but as a mirror. His image had been quiet, restrained, and emotionally accessible. That accessibility had invited affection, but it had also invited projection. Fans had filled the spaces he left open with their own meanings. When those meanings were disrupted, the loss felt personal. This is the paradox of modern fame. Visibility creates connection, but it also dissolves boundaries. The more someone is seen, the less control they retain over how they are interpreted. Over time, the person becomes a composite of public expectation, emotional investment, and symbolic value. When that composite is disturbed, the reaction is not rational. It is visceral. The incident forced a broader question into public view. What responsibility does society hold toward the figures it elevates? Admiration is often framed as harmless, even benevolent. But admiration without restraint can harden into entitlement. The belief that access to an image implies access to meaning. The belief that affection grants ownership. Art, in this case, did not exist in isolation. It collided with a culture already saturated by parasocial bonds, accelerated by platforms that reward emotional intensity. The exhibit did not create these dynamics. It exposed them. The discomfort that followed was not an accident. It was a consequence. Psychologists and cultural analysts continue to unpack the phenomenon, describing a generation raised on mediated intimacy. People learn to recognize faces before understanding boundaries. They feel closeness without proximity, loss without departure. When symbols fracture, the grief feels real because the emotional investment was real. Yet, there is no villain in this story that can be easily named. The institution retreated. The artwork vanished. The audience dispersed. What remained was a shared awareness that something fundamental had been revealed. The realization that silence does not protect, and that absence does not guarantee dignity. In a world where every image can be replicated, preserved, and repurposed, even stillness can be consumed. The story does not end with resolution. It ends with responsibility. Responsibility for creators to consider not only intention, but impact. Responsibility for platforms to recognize the cost of amplification. Responsibility for audiences to examine the expectations they project onto people they do not know, but feel deeply connected to. Because the final lesson was never about art or controversy. It was about limits. And the unsettling truth left behind was this: if even silence can be consumed, then what does fame truly leave behind?